My brother's rehearsal dinner was on a Friday night in October, and I remember sitting at the table thinking the breadsticks were the best part of my evening. Not because they were particularly good. Because nobody had spoken to me in 40 minutes. I had paid for the venue. Let me back up. Because if I start there, you will think I am exaggerating. And I need you to understand that I am not. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 31 years old. I am a licensed CPA, and for the better part of a decade I have been the financial backbone of a family that treated me like a liability they kept meaning to write off. My brother Daniel is 27. He is charming, he is the favorite, and he has never once balanced a checkbook in his life because he has never had to. My mother handled everything for him until he was 24, and then I took over from her, not because anyone asked me directly, but because that is how it works in families like mine. The responsible one does not get chosen. She gets volunteered by circumstance, and then she gets blamed for not doing enough. My father worked in logistics for 30 years. He retired early on a pension that covered his golf membership and not much else. My mother did bookkeeping part-time for a dental office. Between the two of them, they managed fine as long as nothing unexpected happened. The problem is that in our family, unexpected things happened constantly, and they were never small. There was the time the transmission on my father's truck blew out 2 weeks before Christmas. $4,000. I wired it the same afternoon they called. There was the time my mother needed a procedure her insurance classified as elective. $1,100. I paid it before she finished explaining. There was the time Daniel got himself into a situation with a landlord that required a lawyer, and the lawyer required a retainer, and the retainer required me to quietly drain most of my emergency fund, and not mention it to anyone, because Daniel did not want my parents to know how badly he had handled things. I mention these not to catalog my suffering. I mention them because they are the context without which nothing that follows will make sense. When Daniel told me he was getting married, I was genuinely happy for him. His fiancée, a woman named Brooke, seemed steady in a way Daniel historically had not been. She had a real job. She paid her own bills. I thought she might be good for him. What I did not anticipate was becoming the silent underwriter of their entire wedding. It started with a phone call from my mother in January, about 9 months before the wedding date. She asked if I was planning to contribute to the celebration. I said of course. I would buy a gift. I would take care of my travel expenses. I would be there. She laughed in the specific way she laughed when she thought I was being deliberately obtuse. She meant money, real money. She meant that Daniel and Brooke wanted a wedding that cost more than either of their families could comfortably cover, and since I was the one with the stable income and no children and, as she put it, no real expenses of my own, it seemed natural that I would want to help make my brother's day special. I want to be clear about something. I was not angry in that moment. I was tired in a way that had no bottom. But I said yes, because I always said yes, and because I had not yet learned what saying yes was actually costing me. Over the next several months, the contributions accumulated. $6,000 toward the venue deposit when Brooke's parents came up short. $1,800 for the florist when my mother decided the original arrangement looked cheap. $2,200 for the rehearsal dinner, which my father had originally offered to host at their house before deciding their backyard was not large enough, and quietly stepping back from the commitment without formally stepping back from the credit. Nobody announced at any point that I was paying for things. That was not how it worked. My mother would mention a shortfall, I would cover it, and life moved on. Daniel and Brooke sent thank you texts that felt like receipts. My father said things like we really pulled it together at family dinners, using a we that apparently included my bank account but not my name. By the time October arrived, I had contributed just over $14,000 to a wedding I had not been consulted about, not been thanked for publicly, and not been given any role in beyond writing checks. My bridesmaid invitation came late. Very late. As in, 6 weeks before the wedding, Brooke texted me asking if I would consider being a bridesmaid, and the word consider was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The dresses had already been chosen. The fittings were already scheduled. She was asking me to show up in a dress that had been selected without me, in a color I would not have chosen, at a fitting appointment that had to be rescheduled twice to accommodate me, because I had not been part of the original plan. I said yes. I always said yes. The week before the wedding, I flew home and stayed in my childhood bedroom, which my mother had partially converted into a craft room, so I slept on a daybed surrounded by fabric swatches and a hot glue gun that kept falling off the shelf. My father greeted me at the door with a handshake, which is his version of warmth, and told me I looked tired. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant my mother had selected. The private dining room held about 30 people. I walked in and found my name card at the far end of the table, wedged between a second cousin I had met twice, and one of Daniel's college friends who spent the entire meal on his phone. Brooke's parents were at the head of the table. My parents were flanking Daniel, and Brooke in the center. There were 11 people between me and my brother. I sat down. I ordered water. I ate the breadsticks. At some point during the salad course, my mother stood up and gave a small toast. She talked about what a blessing it was to see Daniel find his person. She talked about the family coming together to make this celebration happen. She named Brooke's parents by name and thanked them for their generosity. She thanked a specific aunt for driving 4 hours to be there. She did not say my name. Not an omission I was imagining. I watched her scan the room while she was speaking. Her eyes moved across my section of the table, the way you move across background scenery. I was part of the atmosphere, not the guest list. Daniel caught my eye for exactly 1 second after she sat down. Then he looked away and laughed at something Brooke's father said. I did not cry. I was past crying about this particular family. What I felt instead was something quieter and more clarifying, like a fog lifting all at once, and under the fog, everything was very still and very obvious. I finished my meal. I drove back to my parents' house. I lay on the daybed next to the hot glue gun and I opened my laptop and I started reading. I had co-signed a loan. 2 years earlier, my parents had wanted to refinance their mortgage to pull out equity for some renovations. Their credit was serviceable but not strong enough on its own for the rate they wanted. My mother called and explained the situation, and I agreed to co-sign. And a few weeks later, I sat through a closing via overnight documents and added my name to a financial obligation tied to a house I did not live in. I had not thought about that co-signature much since then. I paid my own bills. My credit was excellent. The loan had not affected me in any visible way. But lying there in October, listening to my father snore through the wall, I pulled up my credit report and looked at the entry and thought about what it meant that my name was on that document. It meant I had leverage I had never used. It also meant I had a responsibility I was currently carrying for people who had just thanked everyone in a room except me. I did not make any decisions that night. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what happened next was not impulsive. It was not a tantrum. It was not the act of someone who snapped at the wrong moment and did something they later regretted. It was the act of someone who had been paying attention for a long time and finally decided to pay attention to herself. The wedding was on Saturday. It was, objectively, beautiful. The flowers were extraordinary. The venue was warm and golden in the afternoon light, and Brooke was genuinely stunning. And Daniel cried when he saw her, which was the most human I had seen him be in years. I stood at the end of the bridesmaid line in the dress that had been chosen without me, holding flowers that matched everyone else's, and I smiled, and I meant it, at least for that part. The reception was where it unraveled. The seating chart placed me at table 7. I know this sounds like a small thing. I know table numbers are logistical, not personal, and I know that someone has to sit at every table. But table 7 was in the back corner of the room, near the entrance to the kitchen, and it seated myself, 2 of Brooke's coworkers who did not know anyone, an elderly great-uncle who was hard of hearing, and a couple who I later determined had been included because they were the neighbors of someone and nobody quite knew how to leave them off the list. The head table, where Daniel and Brooke sat with their wedding party, was also where my parents were seated. As mother and father of the groom, they had been placed at the center of the room's attention. I was near the kitchen. During dinner, my mother gave another speech. This one was longer. She talked about the journey of planning this wedding, about the love that had gone into every detail. She thanked Brooke's mother by name twice. She thanked the coordinator. She thanked the florist. She held up her glass and said she was grateful for every single person who had helped make this day possible. She looked directly at Brooke's parents when she said that last part. I was eating my chicken at table 7. When the dancing started, I found my brother at the edge of the floor. He was flushed and happy, and I put my hand on his arm and told him he looked great, that I was happy for him, that I hoped he and Brooke built something real together. I meant every word. I also told him that I was going to head out a little early, because I had a flight to catch in the morning. He nodded and hugged me and said thanks for everything, seriously, and then someone called his name and he was gone. That was the last conversation I had at the wedding. I went back to the hotel I had quietly booked for myself rather than staying another night in the craft room, and I ordered room service, and I sat at the desk, and I opened my laptop again. I had looked up the process once, out of curiosity, 2 years prior. The process for requesting to be released from a co-signed loan, or alternately, the process involved if a co-signer wishes to initiate a review of the obligation. I had bookmarked the page and forgotten about it. I found the bookmark. I also called my own attorney on Monday morning. Not my family's attorney, who was a man my father had used for 30 years, and who would have called my father before returning my call. My attorney, whom I had retained 18 months earlier, for an unrelated contract matter, and whose number I still had in my phone. I explained the situation. I asked what my options were. She was thorough and calm, and at the end of the conversation, she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "You're not obligated to remain financially entangled with people who have made clear they don't consider you a stakeholder." She was right. The letter went out on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the wedding. It was formal and correct, and said exactly what it needed to say, which was that I was initiating the process of requesting removal from the co-signed mortgage obligation, and that in accordance with the loan terms, the primary borrowers would need to demonstrate independent qualification or refinance within the specified window. The window was 60 days. I sent it through my attorney's office. I did not call ahead. I did not warn anyone. I sent it the same way my mother had conducted every financial conversation with me, which is to say, as a notification rather than a discussion. My father called me on a Thursday. I did not answer. My mother called 4 times on Friday. I did not answer. Daniel called on Saturday morning, which was exactly 8 days after the letter arrived, based on the delivery confirmation I had requested. He left a voicemail. His voice had that particular quality of someone trying to sound calm, while clearly not being calm, and he said that Mom and Dad had received some paperwork and were confused, and could I call him back so we could sort this out as a family. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I texted my attorney and asked her to handle any further communication. My mother eventually reached me through my aunt, who called and said simply that things were very serious at home, and that my parents were devastated, and that surely I understood the position I was putting them in. I told my aunt that I loved her, and that I was not in a position to discuss the matter directly, and that anyone who needed to reach me about the loan should contact my attorney's office. My aunt was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I always thought they didn't appreciate you enough." That sentence held more acknowledgement than I had received in a decade of wire transfers. My parents did ultimately refinance. It took them the full 60 days and a good deal of scrambling and, I was told secondhand, some fairly uncomfortable conversations with a mortgage broker about their debt-to-income ratio. The new loan is in their names only. My credit report no longer carries their house. I have not been to a family dinner since October. I send birthday cards. I respond to group texts with neutral, brief replies. I have not transferred money to anyone in my family since the florist invoice I paid last September, which I have decided to consider my final donation to the cause. Daniel texted me in February. Not about the loan, which had been resolved by then. He texted to say that he and Brooke were expecting, and that he hoped I would be part of their child's life. He said he knew things had been complicated and that he wanted to do better. I read it on a Tuesday morning while I was having coffee at my own kitchen table, in my own apartment, in a city I had moved to 3 years ago because I needed distance and had not taken nearly enough of it. I thought about what it meant to do better. I thought about the rehearsal dinner, and the wedding, and the years of wire transfers, and the craft room daybed, and the speeches that named every person in every room except me. I thought about my aunt saying she always knew they did not appreciate me enough, and how that quiet admission had cracked something open I had not realized was still sealed. I texted Daniel back. I said congratulations, and that I wished him and Brooke well, and that I needed time before I could figure out what any kind of relationship looked like going forward. He did not respond to that text. I noticed, and then I let it go. There is a version of this story where I am the villain. I know that version exists because I have heard pieces of it from secondhand sources. In that version, I blindsided my parents over a paperwork technicality. I blew up my brother's newlywed happiness over a seating chart. I let pride turn me into someone cold and transactional. I would like to offer the other version. In the other version, a woman spent 10 years writing checks and catching falls and covering shortfalls without ever being asked what she needed or thanked for what she gave. In the other version, she sat at table 7 near the kitchen door, while her mother named every generous person in the room, and her eyes passed over her daughter like furniture. In the other version, the woman did not scream, did not make a scene, did not send a single angry message. She finished her chicken. She hugged her brother. She drove to her hotel. And then she made some phone calls and signed some papers, and quietly removed herself from obligations she had never been asked to take on, and was never thanked for carrying. In that version, that is not cruelty. That is the most polite possible way of finally being heard. I drink my coffee every morning in my apartment, and I read, and I breathe, and nobody calls me before 8 a.m. in a panic about a shortfall, or a transmission, or a medical bill. My savings account has recovered. My sleep has recovered. Something in me that had been bracing for impact for years has slowly, tentatively, begun to relax. Have you ever been the person who covered everything and got credit for nothing? Have you ever sat in a room full of people who love each other and understood, very quietly, that you are the infrastructure and not the family? If you have, you already know the end of this story. Not the letter to the mortgage company. Not the voicemails I did not return. The real end, which is a Tuesday morning and a cup of coffee, and the particular peace that comes from no longer waiting for someone to finally say your name. They never did, so I stopped waiting. And that, it turns out, was the only gift I needed to give myself.